Are you sure we should be ploughing north into Scotland in the middle of winter, my lord?
Well, the king just resigned the Magna Carta. I don't think he's going to be too eager to stay put.
Well, I wish you luck on the campaign, my lord.
Oh no, Jocelyn, the king is keeping me in London, but you're my best man. You're going to Scotland.
Where we left off last time, Earl Roger Bigod of Norfolk had just successfully led a revolt of the aristocracy to lower taxes and somewhat rein in excessive foreign wars. Now that the king has agreed to lower taxes, personally lead the army into a war in Scotland, and re-sign the Magna Carta, Earl Roger finds himself a thorn in the king's side with little direct power and no heir to his titles. With that in mind, and his duties keeping him in London, Roger decides to elect Bishop Jocelyn to lead his levy north. Many might think it odd for a bishop to lead the Earl's men into battle, but it was true. Jocelyn really was Roger's best commander, and besides, Jocelyn was no city priest. His parish was full of rough-and-tumble farmers and laborers who were well acquainted with the marshy Norfolk coasts. He led his flock by example, and he was not the type to back down from a fight. The division between sword and crook was at best of times hazy, and Jocelyn took up the robes after returning as a veteran of King Edward's war in the Levant. This was the man that Roger sent north, and after his initial surprise, Jocelyn didn't even balk at the prospect. Along with him came a landless noble named Lawrence of Norwich, who Roger had recently met in London and thought might be a handy courtier to have around. While Lawrence was good with keeping an account book, Jocelyn knew from the moment they met that the man didn't know which end of the sword was the hilt. Nevertheless, the two of them saddled their horses and set off for the front. While the king's levy began to wind its way up through the Midlands, he remained in London, acting as the king's marshal. This is the position which gave Roger the authority to speak out against the king in Parliament, and so it held within it a certain tension. The seat gave him power over the king, but he was also there only because of him, and he could be recalled at any time. In London, he made sure the necessary supplies were being shipped to the front and monitored the war in Scotland by looking at dispatches and letters, taking careful account of each paper, and thus made manifest his bloody calculus of war. It was during one of these long nights, reading notes from Scotland, that Roger received a message from the local clergy, directed towards King Edward, asking whether he would consider joining a crusade which had recently been called to retake the Holy Land. Roger himself had no intention of casting off towards who knows where, for a church that in his opinion took tithes and did little else. As for his liege King Edward, well, he was already fighting a war, and so Roger took the message and filed it away somewhere the king's family wouldn't see it. Meanwhile, the autumn showers gave way to winter snows as Jocelyn and Lawrence trudged north to Scotland. When they arrived near the borderlands, they learned that many of the northern lords had already made short work of the defenses in the Scottish frontier, and Robert de Bruce was nowhere to be seen. Some reports suggested that he was mounting an expedition to cross the Irish Sea into Ulster, where he would rally support amongst any Irish locals chafing against English rule. Lawrence wanted to make a crossing to go investigate the rumors, but Jocelyn recognized that it was folly to do that with a force their size, and so instead they laid siege to Jedburgh in West Lothian while awaiting news of the Scottish army. January sieges are not kindly, and there was many a night when Lawrence would come into Jocelyn's tent drunk as anything and demand they head back south before all their men froze to death, but Jocelyn held firm and did his best to keep the camp in order. It wasn't long before the siege in Jedburgh got word that King Edward's men had met with the force led by Robert de Bruce in County Ulster, and the Scots had been soundly defeated. Soon enough, the Scottish army was back in Scotland proper, and Bruce made the brash decision to strike south into Lothian and try to break the English troops occupying the Scottish countryside to the north of Jedburgh. This attack was repulsed by Edward's forces, and after that the Scottish army practically disintegrated. Jocelyn wrote back to Roger about their great success in the north and the impending defeat of the Scots in the spring of 1298. He also included a scalding disavowal of Lawrence, who, wouldn't you know it, didn't return to Norfolk after the end of the war. It was about the time he received the letter from Jocelyn that Roger began to have some trouble back home. It was always dangerous to be in government while the king was away, because they're more likely to make rash decisions when their mind is otherwise occupied, and this very thing must have occurred when, after a series of disagreements between Roger and the king over logistics, Roger was recalled from his position as Marshal, and his titles were repositioned under the dominion of the 14-year-old Duke of York. Even though Roger was not entirely surprised, he was livid enough to be almost completely unaffected the next week when his wife Alex told him she was with child. This would be Roger's first child, and ordinarily he would have been grateful to know his family's legacy would be preserved, but instead he merely spent 3 weeks hunting and brooding with courtiers. In fact, the only thing which brought Lift back into his steps was the news on the 25th of July that the king had died in camp somewhere in Ayrshire. The king's death came as a complete surprise to most of England. Although he had been advancing in age, he wasn't sickly. He also didn't die in battle, though he was spry enough to be seen often in the command tent or near the fighting. No, one morning his servants had entered the tent to wake him, and he simply didn't rise. The crown then fell to his son, now King Edward II, who was the tender age of 14. With this situation not being accounted for, Earl Moyris of Leinster quickly stepped in to fill the role of regent. A crafty and ambitious man, it is no surprise that in the brief 2 years of his regency he managed to elevate himself from the Earl of Leinster to the Duke of Munster. Moyris also made the decision to betroth the young King Edward to a young girl named Constantia, who was the granddaughter of a Spanish king. It was an uncertain match, as many influential English nobles had unwed daughters, as did the current monarchs of Western Europe, but ultimately any grumbling was silenced, since the pick was only unusual and not controversial. But Roger was not involved in very much of this at all. Stripped of his title as Marshal, and now with the Duke of York between him and the king, he was settling into what he thought might become a more quiet life. It was around this time that his first child was born, and they named her Philippine, after Alex's mother. Though Roger had made it to the age of 53 without having any children, without stopping to think he might be the kind of person to even like children, he found that when he saw Philippine for the first time, he softened a little bit. He considered that it may be a good thing that he's no longer at the center of England's political turmoil. After all, now he was responsible for the safety of someone that wouldn't be able to protect themselves for a long time. Unfortunately for Roger, though he ceased to turn the wheels of politics, they continued to roll through unsteady territory. For one, the Pope had refused to acknowledge or crown King Edward the Younger, since neither he nor his father had been pious enough to join his Holy Crusade. While Roger may have been somewhat to blame for that, he most certainly did not agree with the solution that Duke Moyris cooked up with King Edward. They decided that since the Pope would not recognize them, they would not recognize the Pope, and instead they named the Bishop of Durham Pope Nicholas V. The Pope in Durham then had the honor of crowning the young King Edward, ending the period of the boy's regency. Needless to say, if the Pope in Rome was upset with the English crown then, he was even more displeased now. To add insult to injury, a few months later the Pope sent a missive to England proclaiming the glorious success of the crusade and wishing strength and grace to the new King of Jerusalem, Amaury de Lusignan. Edward took the slight in stride and trusted that Duke Moyris had helped him make the correct long-term decision. To make matters worse for the king, rumors had already started circulating that though Queen Constantia had arrived in England and the two had been married, they still had not yet consummated the union. In the more salacious rumor mills of the English court, gossips even suggested that Moyris and Edward had named the Pope in Durham so that Edward might more easily request a divorce after he realized the poorness of the match. At one point, attending a feast in London, Earl Roger realized that he was a part of that rumor circuit. Not that he necessarily started any rumors, but more so that his greatest contribution to English politics was now telling stories about King Edward Longshanks and speculating on the future of the nation. And frankly, he just didn't want that to be his legacy. So Roger sent a letter to the king telling him that if he ever needed any counsel, he could trust an old, if adversarial, advisor of his father. When the king did not respond, he wrote another letter. The second attempt led to a regular correspondence between the two, and if just for a moment, Roger was content to have a bit of influence over the young king. After all, Roger saw much of himself in the young monarch, and thought the king had the potential to be a good ruler. They were both kind and trusting of others, often to their own detriment. They were both skeptical of the church, and Roger got the feeling that they both sincerely wanted what was best for England. Roger thought what the king needed was some more fire in his belly. He was always too ready to compromise, and was afraid of taking initiative. Despite his new correspondence with the king, Roger could not help still feeling a bit left out of the crowd in London. In response, he thought that it might be a good idea to hold a big feast in Thetford, his seat of power. He would get to spend some time with his wife and daughter, and all the local landholders would have to come and express their devotion to him. He would see Bishop Jocelyn, who, while critical of much of Roger's actions as marshal, was always more of a comfort to Roger than other priests. The feast began as a great success, and Roger was feeling in a rare state of cheer as he traded stories about Philippine with his wife. They talked about her walking, her talking. Roger joked that when she was older she would probably be smarter than both of them put together, judging by how quickly she was learning. But the mood quickly shifted in the feast hall, when one of Roger's servants named Thomas tripped on a loose floorboard and spilled wine all over Philip, the mayor of Ipswich. Roger knew that the mayor was a bit of a hothead, so he immediately got up and began to walk over as Philip stood up from his chair and stared down Thomas, who was now cowering against the wall, pale as a sheet. Philip grabbed the servant by the front of the tunic, and Roger began to rush over, yelling, "Philip, stop!" But before he could do anything, Philip took a knife from his belt that he usually kept for cutting dinner and slit Thomas's throat, draining blood all over the floor the poor boy had tripped on just a few moments ago. Roger's wife Alex screamed, and gasps erupted through the hall as Roger told his guards to grab Philip. Looking a little surprised, Philip swung around, brandishing the knife, drunkenly yelling that all he had done was kill a filthy peasant. The guards hesitated, and then Jocelyn rose from the table and used a walking stick someone had propped up against the wall to swing down hard against Philip's hand, knocking the knife onto the ground. After that, the guards grabbed him and threw him into prison. After that day, Roger was never quite the same. He had seen men die in battle, but this was different. Alex would write to her sisters that there were times when Roger would wake up in the middle of the night, shaking and covered in sweat, talking about how he couldn't save the boy. A year passed, and Roger didn't attend many more feasts. When Alex told him she was again with child, he only remarked that he would hope to see the child grow up. He didn't feel like he had many more years left in him. Several months later, the child was born. Roger decided to call him George, hoping he too would be able to slay a dragon of one kind or another. Thus began a few dark months for Roger. His newborn son was sickly and looked like he might not make it, and Philippine had recently become ill as well. That time saw Roger sentencing poachers to death and yelling at courtiers for small slights. Even Alex felt a bit distant from him. The only one he still got along with was Philippine, and Roger spent long nights with his physicians micromanaging her health. By this time, the king had grown so close to Roger through their correspondence that he would regularly express his concern over Roger's health and ask after the well-being of Philippine. Curiously, Philippine grew to have an interest in her own health, and rather than be scared of her own potential demise, she would spend hours on end talking to the physicians about how the body worked. Eventually she got better, but she never stopped asking, and started spending most of her days studying with the clergy. Roger grew a bit concerned over Philippine's proximity to godliness. After all, he didn't trust priests, and he didn't want his only daughter to end up a nun. He didn't realize quite yet that Philippine was far more interested in the books than the prayer. And just when Roger thought that his life might contain little more of consequence, he received a missive from King Edward that he was needed back in London. The Pope in Rome had convinced the King of France to wage war against England in order to depose the Pope in Durham, and the French were already preparing to cross the Channel. Along with the command to return to London was an edict declaring Roger to be the new Duke of Norfolk, releasing him from the vassalage of the Duke of York, and granting him a new vassal, Walter, the Earl of Suffolk. Shocked by how suddenly the war had broken out, Roger kissed his wife and children goodbye and gathered his levy to march to London. As Roger entered Essex, his scouts informed him that a French force a bit larger than his own had already landed in the county. Roger considered fighting them, but thought it wiser to head directly to London and meet with the king. Unfortunately, as Roger crossed into Bedfordshire, he received bad news. Messengers from Westminster informed him that King Edward had preemptively crossed the Channel with 19,000 soldiers in order to bait the French into fighting the war on their land rather than in England. The gambit had failed, and now nearly 10,000 French troops were laying siege to London and Westminster. Roger watched helplessly, sending messages urging the king to come back to England, as 10,000 more soldiers arrived from Rome itself, followed by even more Frenchmen. The south of England was now being devastated by foreign invaders, and Roger had only a force of perhaps a tenth of the size of the enemy's. Word has it that when Westminster was finally sacked by the French army, Roger remarked that, quote, all of England had been brought low by this king's folly. When one of the French armies caught wind that he was mustering in Essex, they attempted to take the battle to him. Roger had no choice and lowered his levies and broke as everyone made a mad dash back to Norfolk. Upon his return, Roger set to work preparing Thetford for a siege, so that his family would be safe in the event that the French should march north into Norfolk. Meanwhile, Walter, the Earl of Suffolk, was making his own preparations, and begged Roger to send troops to defend his seat. Roger felt he had his hands tied. There were 11,000 Frenchmen laying siege in Suffolk, and Roger could only muster short of 2,000 soldiers. Some weeks later, Earl Walter arrived in Thetford, haggard and irate, informing Roger that 2 of his brothers had been killed in the fighting as the French stormed his castle. Roger, who was no stranger to loss himself, offered a heartfelt condolence to Walter, but always felt that Walter never really forgave him. A month or so later, as reports began to circulate about whether the French would push into Norfolk, Walter arrived at Roger's study and asked for an audience. Roger agreed, but asked why he had to meet in private. Walter then told him that Eustace, the Bishop of Norwich, was plotting with the French commander. Now, Eustace was Roger's spymaster, and so that gave Roger pause. But he also thought that perhaps because of the skills that made Eustace a good spymaster, he might have been able to stage these covert meetings. Walter told Roger that Eustace wanted to be Archbishop of Durham, after Nicholas V was deposed, and in exchange he would let the French into Thetford so they wouldn't have to lay a siege. Roger was completely floored, and decided to give Walter the benefit of the doubt. After all, if Roger ignored him, it could mean the death of his family and subjects. So Roger had Eustace arrested and thrown in prison, despite Eustace's claims that the accusations were false and based on no evidence. Better safe than sorry, Eustace. Of course, now Roger needed a new spymaster. Walter had clearly shown an aptitude for uncovering plots and getting people to talk to him, and besides, his only Earl should probably get a seat on his council. So Roger appointed Walter. When Roger asked him to take the seat, Walter didn't believe it at first, and said that he thought no providence might fall upon him for the rest of his life after all the pain he had suffered in the war. The Earl of Suffolk. This guy's trouble. Duke Roger was also upset about the war. His regular correspondences with the king had been ignored for months now, and so Roger set about to write what he thought might be his last letter to King Edward. It was brief, and we still have a copy of it today. It reads, My liege King Edward II, my trust in you had carried very far these past years. I had hoped that you would heed the advice of your elders, for while the crown does impart great power, it does not always bring with it great wisdom. The war in England is lost, my lord, and the fires over Westminster burn bright. You fight on in Normandy, but what good are the towns you take across the Channel when your subjects bleed and beg at home? And this all for a young man's dream of being the king of the English and of the Christians. Make peace with the Pope, and come home, before more people starve, lose their homes, or are killed by Frenchmen looking for dinner. Your loyal subject, Roger Bigod, Duke of Norfolk. Rather unexpectedly, Roger received a response to this letter, but this time it was icy at best. The king rejected responsibility for the war, defended his decision to continue fighting in Normandy, and effectively doubled down on every decision he had made since the war began. Roger's only solace was once again his children, and even then Philippine had grown timid. He had never raised his voice to her, but she had seen him yelling at courtiers and arguing with her mother, and so the two simply didn't talk like they used to. A year on, after yet more of the Southlands were put to the torch by the French and the Romans, King Edward II was finally forced to negotiate. His loss was complete. While he was still allowed to remain king, he was forced to banish the Pope in Durham, to be replaced with an archbishop appointed directly by the Catholic Church. and Edward II was also forced to acknowledge the Pope as the head of the Church and the highest point of divine authority beneath God himself. Roger heard the news and realized that he was right in the worst possible kind of way. He had been correct about the Pope in Durham being a foolish decision. He had been correct about how the king should have returned to England rather than fight in France. And he had been correct that the king he had so much hope in turned out to be nothing more than a fool in his eyes. And for what? He and his wife argued constantly. The southern half of his duchy was practically desolate. His daughter wouldn't meet his eyes. He didn't even retain the illusion that the king respected him or his opinions. What Roger didn't realize was that the real problem was perhaps not the person who was wearing the crown, but the crown itself. All people are tempted to folly in their lives, but the greater the difference in how much power is possessed by the lowliest person and how much is possessed by those who make decisions which affect everyone, the more likely it is that power holders will have no reason to be accountable to their subjects. More so than the Earl of Suffolk or even the king himself, the common folk of the Southland suffered for a decision made solely by King Edward the Younger and his regent. And yet, those who lived as artisans in London or serfs in the Suffolk countryside are much like Roger's servant Thomas and the family he left behind. They are the ones who have been hurt by noble caprice, and yet to stand up against it is criminal. Instead, their only hope of justice lies in appealing to nobility rather than any formal means of accountability. To his credit, Roger was a just noble most of the time, but even the most just noble is still prone to err, as all humans are, and the person who noticed King Roger's faults most acutely was, no doubt, himself. After failing to prevent the king from making his grand mistakes, failing to protect Earl Walter's family, and failing to be the calm, measured husband and father he should be, Roger was deeply tired and skeptical of his chances for redemption. Everyone around him knew this to be his lowest point. While Roger was sure that all his subjects hated him, Alex and Philippine felt his pain deeply, and both made plans for themselves about how they would try to help him out of his rut and be the person they believed he had the capacity to be. Unfortunately, their hopes were dashed, because it seemed that Roger himself had lost the will to change again. And on the morning of December 7th, 1307, Duke Roger could not find the will to wake up again, and passed away in his sleep. Oh, I died as I was looking at Galicia Volhynia. So now I'm playing as my 3-year-old son.